Hi, this is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. As we sit here on Tuesday, the closing arguments are being presented in a courtroom in Manhattan. Donald Trump's lawyers have finished, and the district attorney is summing things up. And I must say, although I don't want to diminish the legal skills of the defense counsel, they have a small problem, and that is their client. Not only do they have a bad set of facts, but they have a client who insists upon making dumb arguments. For example, he wants to insist that he never had an affair with Stormy Daniels. Really, who believes that at this point in the game? He wants us to believe that the payment to Michael Cohen really was for legal services. Who believes that? Even Donald Trump had admitted that it wasn't. So by making these arguments in the closing statement, the defense counsel kind of gives the jury the idea that they're full of it, to be honest, that they're pulling the wool over their eyes. And you'd be surprised how those things really impact a jury. Many years ago, some lawyers made the mistake of putting me on a jury, and it was a fascinating experience. And I will tell you, one of the things that jurors do is not necessarily look at every witness, every argument. They kind of have a gestalt. They look at the whole picture and they say, which of these two sides is kind of making it up, is kind of taking things out of context, is really not that credible, and which side is basically telling us the straight scoop. After all, people's memories are bad. People do shade the truth, but which side seems more credible? Now, in a criminal case, it can't just be a 50-50. It has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's what the prosecution is now telling the jury. We have a mound of evidence, they are saying, a veritable mountain of evidence that our side of the story, that Donald Trump paid hush money to these women and tried to cover it up by disguising it as legal services. There's a ton of documentation on that. They don't have to rely on Michael Cohen. You don't like Michael Cohen, they say? Don't believe Michael Cohen. But there's Stormy Daniels, there's David Pecker, there's Hope Hicks, and there's all this documentation. And I think they have clearly made the case beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump is guilty of these crimes. The question in my mind is whether there is one or two jurors who are not necessarily in the bag for Donald Trump, but who simply can't get themselves to a conviction. Either they have some kind of personal pique or dislike for the DA, or they think Donald Trump has been given a raw deal, or they think this is somehow unfair, and that person doesn't think he should be convicted. And that's how juries get hung, if there's one or two people like that. I will also say that you should be comforted by one thing, that once you get back in the jury room and you have the dynamics of 12 people, it is very hard for a single juror to hold out. It's not that they get arm twisted or people yell at them. There are all those movies about, sweaty people in a room and they're huddled over the one holdout juror. It doesn't work like that. These juries bond together and they really develop a close collaborative relationship, and they do listen to one another. And I think, judging from a lot of the body language that's been described, their attentiveness, I think the vast majority of people, maybe all of them, going right in off the bat will say, yes, there's enough to convict. And then it's a question, can they come to agreement? Now, there are ways to split the baby. It is not an option, however, for them to find that Donald Trump is only guilty of a misdemeanor. It gets a little bit in the weeds, but the basic line is that the statute of limitations has run out on misdemeanors, but felonies, that's a different story. Now, there are 34 different counts, and with each of those counts, it essentially revolves around a bookkeeping an invoice, and a check. So it is possible that on some of those counts in which Donald Trump actually signed off on the check, that the jury finds, yes, there's absolutely no doubt in our minds that Donald Trump knew what he was doing, that these were fraudulent, and we have the proof. They may say, well, in other cases, some of these other checks, who knows whether he had this in mind. Now, listen, that doesn't make much sense, because if you're paying money every month, obviously one check is pretty much like the other one. But if they wanted to appear to the American public like they really considered things, or they didn't treat him unfairly, it's possible they could convict on a third of these cases or 2/3 of these counts. But we're going to have to wait, because pretty soon the jury is going to get its instructions and it's going to go behind closed doors. So when are we going to get an answer? Well, I think there's about a 50-50 shot we're going to hear from the jury by late Friday. And that's because they want their weekend. They want to be able to go home and tell their family and friends about whatever they want to tell them. They want to go with a clear mind and a clear conscience. They don't want to think about this anymore. They don't want to have to come back on a Monday. They have lives they would like to return to. But if they don't, and they go into next week, then it may take a few more days. So what have we learned really from this case? And what should we take away? I think the first thing is it matters. It matters a lot, in part because the federal courts are broken. They have been corrupted by a Supreme Court that obviously has the fix in. They are right-wing justices in the majority. You got the flag-flying Alito. You got Clarence Thomas, whose wife was involved in this coup attempt. And they have done everything they can to slow down the January 6th trial itself. And whether it can be restarted, whether it can get underway before the election, is highly, highly doubtful. You then have Judge Cannon, who sits in a courtroom in Florida, who has taken it upon herself to essentially side with Trump on every single ruling, decide nothing on many motions, decide against the defense on others, and is doing her best to make sure that case never comes to trial. This is a disgrace. And when this is all said and done behind us, and if we are fortunate to retain our democracy and have a President Biden and perhaps Democrats in the House and Senate in control, we're going to really have to look at the federal courts. We're going to have to look at reforms. We're going to have to look at what we do when we have such blatant misconduct. Certainly at the Supreme Court, they need an ethics standard, but we also have to look at the district court's rogue judges, rogue decisions. So we have those two cases that are kind of held in abeyance. They're out there, but they're undetermined. There is nothing wrong with a state court conviction. And in fact, I want to stress this. This is the beauty of our federal system. If the federal courts break down for whatever reason, we have state courts. And that's what we're seeing right now. The federal courts, at least at this point, do not seem to be up to the task of holding Donald Trump accountable. But there is a state court. That's in Manhattan. And that's the court that may finally hold him accountable for his crimes, for his sleaze, for his deception, for his lies, for his fraud. And so all eyes turn to New York. I think he will become unglued if, in fact, he is convicted. He will face the potential to go behind bars. As amazing as that may seem, yes, it is possible. And for that reason, I think Donald Trump is probably not having a good week, because the real possibility that the jig is up, the whole charade of Donald Trump, the emperor has no clothes, the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz, it's all behind us. And finally, we may get a ruling that correctly holds him responsible for his conduct. So our democracy is a fragile thing, but the rule of law sometimes comes through. We should hope and pray that those people in New York take their charge seriously, and they do their duty and return a guilty verdict on one or more of these counts, because that may be a decisive factor in making sure Donald Trump never sees the inside of the Oval Office again. So if you like this program and you like our other programs, please tell your friends. They can listen and follow on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, or on YouTube. Just click right there. Bye-bye.